Good morning to each of you and welcome to Forum. My name is Marathana Prothro and I am the Director of General Education here at Bluffton University. One thing that I want to note related to your arts and lecture credits, my friends, if you are a senior who is in a panic, you have enough, hopefully, to get you by in the next few weeks. But also, the registrar's office is a little bit behind as we're posting those credits, so give us a couple of weeks before you start frantically emailing after an event about getting, if it doesn't show up on your thing. But keep a list of all of the things you're attending, just in case the computer gremlins do something funny. So that is my note on those. But before we begin for our Spiritual Life Week Forum today, I invite you to take a moment to turn off your phones, take out the headphones, take a deep breath. Hey, way to go. And now let's welcome Chelsea Campbell, our campus pastor and instructor of religion.
Good morning. As Marathana just mentioned, it is Spiritual Life Week. And every semester we spend 1 week focusing on the spiritual growth of our campus community through a variety of different events. This semester, the ministry team chose the theme of faith and memory to go along with our civic engagement theme this year. It commemorates Bluffton's 125th anniversary, as well as the 500th anniversary of Anabaptism. And in honor of Spiritual Life Week, our forum speaker this morning is Maxwell Kennel. Dr. Maxwell Kennel is the pastor at Hamilton Mennonite Church, the director of Pandora Press, and the editor of its relaunched Anabaptist and Mennonite Studies series. He is the author of Post-Secular History and Ontologies of Violence, and editor of Astrid von Schlachter's new history textbook, Anabaptists from the Reformation to the 21st Century. He currently lives in Hamilton, Ontario, with his wife Amy and their dog Luna. Some fun facts about Max is that he enjoys poodles, ramen, and heavy metal. So please join me in welcoming Maxwell Kennel.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. They made me take the heavy metal out of the presentation, so we'll do that later. So I'm going to begin with an outline of the argument that'll take place over the rest of Forum. I begin from the assumption that we are all bound to remember. By which I mean we can't help it. We can't help but engage in memory. It's inevitable that we remember things. And also our memories and our social bonds are intertwined. Memory is a social thing. It's something we do together. It depends on other people. And so if it's a given that we're always remembering, the question is not whether or not, but it's how. How can we best remember? Because we don't always remember the past so well. So counter to some other voices in the conversation on Anabaptism at 500, my argument is that to remember well, we need to develop an even more critical vision of our subject matter and our Anabaptist tradition. The critical vision that I'm proposing is a bit interdisciplinary. It's a criticism of some Christian theologies that tend to take refuge in idealized doctrines. And it's also a criticism of certain historians who might retreat into just describing the world rather than talking in normative terms. So I'm a bit critical of both theological and historical positions, and my argument is for a new vision of Anabaptist critique. And I'm trying to respond in this presentation and elsewhere to two problems, and you might be familiar with these two problems. The first one is neutrality, where we try to stay neutral on matters of justice. And the second problem is polarization, where we divide in two. We divide our world into opposing sides. And so I'm interpreting Anabaptism, which was and remains neither Catholic nor Protestant. I think neither nor is a helpful interpretive paradigm because it positions Anabaptism between, but also beyond the options it's presented with in our time. So, to begin, we are bound to remember. And this is because our social bonds, what ties us together, they're like ligatures that bind our languages and our cultures and our memories together. So despite all the problems with history repeating itself, especially here and now, we still cannot help but remember. And this isn't to say that we always remember rightly, and I even have questions about whether such a thing is possible. But we're bound to remember in those two senses that I just mentioned. We have an irreducible bond with the past. The past persistently returns to us in the present. And our reflection on that past is inevitable. We're always thinking back. We're always making judgments in the present based on the past. So the question, as I mentioned, is it's not whether or not we're going to remember. It's a question of how to do it best. We could also say the same about faith. Our themes for this week are faith and memory. We are bound to have faith of some sort, by which I mean that it's inevitable and it's essential that we have some trust in some things we cannot see. Our secular and modern ideas often retain their theological structures in the aftermath of secularization. Whether our faith is in God or gods, or in the market economy, or in the movement of history, we are bound to believe some things that we don't have direct empirical access to, and to trust in ways that exceed rationality and logic and reason. This isn't to say that religion always has the last word on all things. It has to be more complex than that theologically satisfied thought that everything is religious and the idea that the secular or non-religious person is just deceived or limited in their understanding of the world. Elsewhere, I write about how political theology needs to move beyond this triumphalist model. But here, I'm here to say to you that both memory and faith tempt us with their satisfying conclusions. We are tempted to think that we remember best, that we have God or history on our side. We are tempted to think that our faith and belief are perhaps superior to those who do not believe. We are also tempted to think that we all agree on the important things, that common sense will soon prevail. But today I want to say to you that faith and memory should be just the opposite of these things. They need to be just the opposite of a satisfying conclusion. Faith and memory should not leave us satisfied. Instead, both should call us into question. Both faith and memory should revoke all that we invoke. If we're looking at the world in a critical enough way, it's all the more critical in our time, then we need to assume that our past and our faith will call us into question instead of reaffirming those pre-decided things we think. Without this, history becomes victor's history, and faith becomes a dogmatic fundamentalism. So the theme for Spiritual Life Week this week leads me into a more specific topic. So today I'm going to reflect a little bit on Anabaptism at its 500th year anniversary. And my argument again is that 500 years of Anabaptism should lead us to a posture that is ever more critical. When held well, this anniversary will lead us to reflect on our values. Instead of being just about a round number, 500, as others have noted, the meaningful subtext beneath Anabaptism at 500 is that we all want an excuse to reflect on our past in the context of history. We're bound to remember. And what binds us to memory is social. It concerns everyone around us. And it's political. And most of all, our memory is normative, whether we like it or not. It pertains to what should be the case, not just what is the case. So our societies are composed at base of social bonds of public trust. We're bound to each other in a social and often spiritual way. And these bonds are what that word religion points toward. The Latin religio, at the core of the word religion, Michael Serres puts it well, it refers to rereading what is bound together. Religion refers to both social bonds that bind us, but also to a repeated act of rereading, and I would also say remembering. Our social bonds animate all of the major concepts that we use, the ideas we use to think about our world. So over the past several years, my own research has been concerned with how our concepts like the secular and the religious, or the concept of violence, depend upon our social bonds. They depend upon our contexts and our communities. What we think is religious and secular in one area might seem very different in another. What we think is violent here might not be so violent there. It depends on our social environment. It's not to say these terms are any less real, but they are socially determined. So my question, when we think about how we are bound socially and politically to remember, is how can we remember more critically? In a recent article in the Mennonite Quarterly Review, I'm suggesting that among the diverse characteristics of Anabaptism, critique is one of the most promising. I see critique as a term that names intellectual, social, practical forms of wisdom and good judgment that can construct and reflect careful representations of the world. Put a little more clearly, critique isn't just this negative project of pointing out problems. It's a deconstructing and reconstructing movement that unmakes and remakes our social bonds with others. This isn't very abstract. We engage in critique all the time when we choose how to spend our time. You've chosen to be here today. When we choose a product to purchase, when we vote or when we don't, when we drive on the highway. In all of these everyday actions, critique is at work. It animates our judgment calls and our decisions with a series of considerations that we run through. We think about what we should and should not do, what we want to do and what we need to do. We consider the rules and norms that govern us. Very funny one is, like, no one told you that you had to sit for this entire presentation, and yet you are sitting. This is what the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu calls the habitus. It's the everyday common sense world we live in. But critique is part of this. We engage critically with the norms that surround us. So critique is always with us. It is a matter then of coming to terms with it, finding terms and language that help us deal with it, and engaging in more intentional and reflective forms of critical thinking that move within and beyond suspicion and criticism of the outside world. But I notice, and I come to reflect and notice on that those who reflect on Anabaptism and care about Anabaptism often hesitate to engage in really sharp forms of critique. Critiques that say no, that set a hard boundary. This might be because many historians and theologians consider Anabaptism to be neither Catholic nor Protestant, but instead representing a third way that is between and beyond these 16th century options. I think this neither nor paradigm is incredibly powerful and important because it can lead us beyond being passive or returning violence for violence. The word third way is there. And between political options like our left and right wing. This model of being neither nor appeals to me for a lot of reasons, and I think it appeals to us because we want to see all sides of an issue. But I want to caution us that third ways can also be avoidant. They can become conflict averse. We can sit on the fence and make false equivalencies, and we can get caught up in seeing two sides, and this can prevent us from making decisions that do justice. Historians in the 1980s and onward have qualified this neither nor characteristic of Anabaptism. They've scolded their interlocutors for forgetting that the Anabaptists were indebted to both the Catholic and mainline traditions that they responded to. This seemed to take the wind out of the sails of texts like Walter Clausen's Anabaptism, neither Catholic nor Protestant. to the point where this phrase, neither Catholic nor Protestant, does not appear in the Brill Companion to Anabaptism and Spiritualism or the T&T Clark Handbook of Anabaptism. This neither nor position, this critical Anabaptist vision, has been critiqued recently by very important voices like John D. Roth. And it's been critiqued for being too negative or divisive. So in his recent forum here on March 9th, John Roth spoke on repentance and good news, saying that we are tempted to repeat these sectarian divisions, thinking that it is an act of faithfulness that we would split when we have disagreements. And while I agree that we must be repentant and humble, and that we must heal the splintering in the body of Christ, as John called us to do a week ago, I think that the emphasis on conciliation and on unity is not exactly what our current cultural moment needs. Good news, it seems to me, is not always found in coming together despite differences. It is very often found when we engage in serious criticism that's able to set boundaries, to say no, and to meaningfully engage with those who we disagree with. And these boundaries might risk more sectarian division, but they can also prevent us from self-betrayal. They can prevent future trauma and wounding. So John is right to say that our tradition did emerge out of conflict and division. I would put it even more strongly. Early Anabaptism is defined by its boundary setting, by its no and refusal of established knowledge and practice. Where John assumes that our temptation to repeat separation and the splintering of the body of Christ comes from this repeating our problematic origin, I argue that there's a more substantial reason to carry forward Anabaptist critique. And that's because without it, we risk sacrificing our boundaries and betraying our commitments, for example, to anti-violence, when we prioritize unity. Anabaptism must recover its ability to be distinctive, to divide, to be negative, to be critical. Because without these tools, we cannot make a better future. But it must do so without the self-satisfied postures that believe, God or history are on our side, and without making an idol of our own identities as critics. That's key. That's a preventative and protective factor in this critique. Many Mennonite theologians today are no longer comfortable positioning Anabaptism as a distinctive or critical option that speaks against other traditions. And instead, the tone has changed in favor of a more conciliatory ecumenism. And I understand this impulse very well, but I fear that sometimes it leaves our Anabaptist discourse bereft of resources for challenging the problems of our time. At times, it feels like anxiety is the reigning affect of Anabaptist history and Mennonite theology today. Historians of Anabaptism, you'll notice, are anxious to remind us that Anabaptism did not absolutely begin in January 1525. And that makes sense. That's true. Theologians in the Mennonite tradition are often anxious to avoid positioning Anabaptism as morally superior, for fear that distinctives will lead to exclusion. This is all understandable enough, given that Anabaptist origins are very complex, and that Mennonite tradition did sustain and perpetrate wounds upon others in a desire to be distinct and to maintain its identity. That much is true. I have great love for theologians and historians who advance these positions, but I'm profoundly dissatisfied with these paradigms that withdraw from critique, that withdraw from distinctives for fear that the act of drawing a hard boundary or making an incisive moral judgment will communicate superiority or triumphalism. Instead, I think we need to engage in ever more critical approaches through more critical reflection on our history and by seeing how criticism and critique has been a part of Anabaptism for 500 years. So to expand on this, I want to provide a critical and comparative reading of these two books. with the aim of showing how we are bound to remember in very specific ways, and how this binding can at times paralyze us or push us to take hold of these bonds in ways that rightly and humbly remember. So it's odd to me that in the past quarter century, no comprehensive or field-defining history of Anabaptism has appeared. It's been many years since books like Arnold Snyder's Anabaptist History and Theology, Hans-Jürgen Gertz's book, The Anabaptists, and the other two popular textbooks of the 90s. But last year, in quite an auspicious way, two comprehensive histories of the Anabaptists were published in English. The first is Troy Osborne's Radicals and Reformers, a survey of global Anabaptist history. And the second is Astrid von Schlachte's Anabaptists from the Reformation to the 21st Century. And that one was originally published in German in 2020, translated into English by Vic Thiessen. And here I will disclose that I studied under Troy Osborne as a graduate student, and I am the series and volume editor of Astrid's book. So my approach to these texts is like anything but impartial. So in my attempt to assert or reassert a kind of Anabaptist critique that can engage with the ways that we're bound to remember, I want to compare how these two history textbooks approach their subject matter. And I want to ask whether Troy Osborne and Astrid von Schlachte, whether their paradigms in these books give us resources to resist neutrality, where we absent ourselves from matters of justice, and polarization, where we divide the world in two. So I'll start with Astrid's book. Astrid von Schlachte's textbook is called Anabaptists, in the plural, and it provides a history spanning all 500 years. And it uses several different paradigms and methodologies. It uses social history, political communication, the study of confessionalization, and it draws a lot from primary sources, like court records and archives, as well as secondary sources. Astrid's approach is very interesting. It's not chronological. Where Troy's book moves chronologically through the years, Astrid jumps around a little bit. That's one notable difference. And I notice that Astrid's approach, it doesn't cater to confessional Mennonites. It doesn't promote faithfulness in or the purity of Anabaptist values. But she also doesn't necessarily resist the desire for a usable past. She doesn't reject the notion that the past matters in the present. Instead, she insists on an honest account of the past that is accountable to the work of professional historians. And indeed, she is quite involved in the German Mennonite celebrations of the 500-year anniversary of Anabaptism, the Gewacht Project. So in general, von Schlachte's stylistic and structural pattern is to provide a series of historical facts and dates, places, and names. And she does so in the context of brief narratives. So she'll give a little narrative vignette. And in doing so, she lets the contradictory and differing nature of her subject matter stand on its own, rather than trying to knit it into a cohesive, coherent whole. She's focused on providing a source-based analysis, quoting from letters and other documents, and she doesn't decide for the reader what the tensions she feels, what they mean. She doesn't engage in interpretation quite that way. And this shows up most clearly at the end of every chapter. So one way to read these two books in comparison is to read the last page of every chapter. Von Schlachte has perfected the art of a cliffhanger ending. Most chapters just end with flat statements of fact, rather than interpretations of the meaning of their subject matter. This allows you, the reader, to see the tensions and contrasts and differences in the text, without forcing their plurality and diversity into a unified whole. Troy Osborne's Radicals and Reformers is quite a different book from Astrid's. Osborne's book is written from a North American perspective rather than a European perspective. It was advised by a committee of scholars as part of the Herald Press connected initiative Anabaptism at 500. And it means that this book is, in a sense, meant to provide Mennonites with a sense of their own history. Radicals and Reformers speaks more frequently than Astrid's book to contemporary global Anabaptism. And both books are concerned with what to do with diversity in the context of their subject matter. So both authors are trained formal historians who hold themselves accountable to their disciplines and their specializations. So Troy Osborne specializes in the Dutch Mennonites, and Astrid specializes in the Hutterites. And there are interesting differences to their approaches that I want to bring to you now for reflection. Osborne's honest account of people who can inspire by their faithfulness as well as instruct from their failures, this paradigm, it's often expressed in the presentation of contrasts or opposing yet complementary sides. So where von Schlachte presents the diversity of Anabaptism in a way that just leaves its contradictory nature unresolved, he's presenting contradictions and differences, Osborne frames differences in the context of a greater whole that is characterized by diversity. So both authors see Anabaptism as a diverse thing. But von Schlachte features the contradictions of Anabaptism's diversity, while Osborne calms those contradictions with a desire for a more even-handed consideration of both sides, or two-sided coins. This is an essential difference in their methodology. Although at times both Osborne and von Schlachte present similar content and contours of Anabaptism, Osborne's even-handedness, or Osborne's emphasis on Anabaptist diversity is more invested in even-handedness or symmetry or unity in difference, in contrast with von Schlachte's approach that often just allows contradictions to stand on their own without comment or resolution. Although this distinction between the two is pretty subtle, my argument is that critically analyzing this difference can lead us somewhere. It's important for us to think about if we're thinking about how we're bound to memory. My critical point is that von Schlachte's hands-off approach and Osborne's even-handed approach, they stop short of providing us resources to deal with some of the political problems of our time, neutrality and polarization. Now, there may be a rejoinder to this, saying that it's not really the role of historians to provide us resources to solve our political problems. But I would insist that all writing of history is political and that the methodological orientation of these historians can't help but reflect their politics. In addition to that, the historian's profession is profoundly threatened in our current political moment. And it's quite important that our learned telling of Anabaptist history can provide us with ways apart from polarization that splits the world in two, and from neutrality that just paralyzes us in seeing both sides. We're currently in a moment where two key problems present themselves to us. You might recognize these two. The first problem is neutrality, or neutralization, where both right-wing and left-wing voices reduce serious and disjunctive conflicts of values to neutral terms that diminish the effects of difference and contradiction. For example, we see this most often in attempts to see both sides. But these attempts often equivocate between two quite uneven options. We might see this in fantasies of commonality and unity, where we appeal to common sense, or we might ask rhetorically, who am I to judge? The second problem is polarization, where conservatives, liberals, everyone in between stoke the fires of demonization. We demonize the other by pointing to the other and presenting difference as inherently dangerous. So the other might be even dehumanized or reduced to ignorance. There are clearly no simple answers to either of these questions and problems. And elsewhere in my book on violence, I've argued that this zero-sum competitive either-or thinking that sees differences as dangerous, it reflects an underlying ontology of violence. It is a violent way of seeing the world. and it requires careful, complex mediations between the dualisms we're given. We can gain some insight, however, into these two problems of neutrality and polarization by looking closely at the two Anabaptist history textbooks I just mentioned. When you read history textbooks for your courses, might be the hands-off approach. This is the one Astrid von Schlachter tends to take, that withdraws from interpreting the tensions that are being representative. Perhaps serious differences, contradictions between different groups are just kind of left without comment. Each of these three approaches risks contributing to the violences that come from polarization and neutrality. Confessional approaches often avoid self-criticism. Liberal positions often look like they criticize both sides, but they just place both sides on equal footing, allowing violence to run rampant. And the hands-off approach that just describes the world, it tends to withdraw from that essential project of resisting the abuse of history in the present. Clearly, Troy Osborne and Astrid von Schlachter do not fall cleanly into any of these categories. They each have different moments in their texts where they might, but as a whole they do not. But the stakes remain. Violence endures in environments where a veneer of neutrality covers over differences and allows injustice to endure. It's because no one wants to appear biased or one-sided. How historians, and anyone, treats differences and contradictions within a category matters a great deal. Underneath a lot of this is a question of what to do with differences when they appear, from the most innocuous to the most contradictory within the categories in question. You might encounter this in yourself, what to do with contradictions within the self. When you think of yourself as a whole being, but your left hand doesn't know what your right hand's doing. This problem scales all the way up. Question is, are differences presented descriptively in ways that allow their contradictory character to stand? We might be honest with ourselves that we think one thing here and the opposite thing here, and we're the same person. Or are differences presented in a way that frame their contradictory character within a whole that's characterized by diversity? Or are there other roads not taken in the complex and contextual mediation of normativity that says how we ought to think and description that says what is? I'll say this at the end of this slide. When we polarize, we bind ourselves to the memory of enmity and opposition. When we neutralize, we bind ourselves back from the pursuit of justice. The Anabaptists were not defined by their unity with other groups or their agreement with the social and political norms of their time. They were defined by critique. They were defined by reforming and revolutionary impulses to resist and challenge and question the received knowledge and common practices of their contexts. Very often they insisted on a far greater pace and severity of reform. They wanted change in their society much faster and more severely than many of their counterparts. The Anabaptists were defined by their challenges to the social and political stabilities of their time, especially in their resistance to infant baptism. In resisting infant baptism, the Anabaptists questioned one of the most definitive identity points of their time. Critique was fundamental to Anabaptism. They were distinctive. They stood out from the Catholic, Lutheran, and Reformed traditions. The historian Jan Assmann emphasizes that the written word, so the history textbooks were reflecting on the spoken word here, the written word is a form of provision, in that it provides foresight. It provides knowledge that can better guide our action, a stockpile of valuable resources and materials for future use, a way to preserve and advance a cultural identity. My argument here is that we would be remiss if we did not use our Anabaptist provisions to move beyond the neutralizing effects of both sides have a point and the polarizing effects of us versus them. This requires critique that is able to say no, to set boundaries, to sharply criticize injustice, all while being honest about the complexities of our history and our present. In this spirit, I want to close right now with a reflection on that core feature of Anabaptism. So if you've learned about Anabaptism in your courses, you've likely learned about how this 16th century group challenged the reigning consensus that infants should be baptized. But baptism does not mean the same thing today as it did in the 16th century. Our major concepts for identity are no longer all about whether we are baptized or not. So when I talk to my friends in universities, in churches, when I observe the culture wars in our public sphere, I notice that our present and weight-bearing concerns are not about baptism. They're about other important identity-forming distinctions. So when I meet people and I want to learn more about them, I notice that our present-day identity questions have more to do with where people stand in relation to a few key distinctions. They're up on the screen. Gender and sexuality, religion and secularity, the liberal-conservative, right-left distinction, and the acceptance or rejection of nationalism. So my question for you in closing, my question for food for thought here, is what idolatrous strongholds of overly simplistic thinking, what rigid categories would an Anabaptist critique overturn today if that same spirit of neither nor was advanced subtly and carefully but persistently in faith and in memory that didn't satisfy us, that called us into question? Each of you will have been presented with simple options. Are you male or female? Are you gay or straight? Are you religious or are you secular? Are you left or are you right? And each of these containers and representations, they corral us into ways of thinking and acting that reduce the fullness and richness of human experience to an either-or. When what we really need are critical combinations of neither nor, refusal, and both and entanglement. Perhaps there's an analogy to be made that allows Anabaptist critique to develop plural, distinctive approaches to pressing social and political problems by acknowledging, the value and indebtedness to both sides we're presented with, while pushing decisively beyond them to emancipatory third ways that neither sit on the fence between two bad options, nor absent themselves entirely from the poles of our debates. So this is my closing question to you. If refusing infant baptism and conducting believers' baptisms was so important and revolutionary 500 years ago, what must be refused and reconstructed today in the name of Anabaptist and Mennonite identities, whose diversity is a critical distinctive? Perhaps Anabaptism can be a category that refuses even itself, given that the interior diversity of its identities contains so many resources for self-critique. Thank you very much for your attention.
So we have lots to think about. Thank you so much, Dr. Kennel, for your presentation. I invite you to take just a couple of minutes and to reflect on those questions that have been presented to you and to see what follow-ups you might have for Dr. Kennel. Take just a couple of minutes. I'll interrupt when it's time to be done.
Thanks.
Okay, Gerald has got the microphone. For those who have a question, I see a question in the very back of the room. I don't, Gerald. I don't. Thank you. What questions do we have?
Thank you for your presentation. Very helpful. I know you mentioned very briefly ecumenism And I wonder if you could say just a little bit more about that. Is that do you view it, not an either or, but as a helpful way to move us, people of faith, in a certain direction? Is it helpful to be ecumenical?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I have to be careful with my answer. So ecumenism meaning the connection and the value of connection across Christian denominations and beyond. I know one of my private frustrations is that sometimes ecumenism is framed just within Christianity, and at times I really want a more critical vision beyond to interreligious dialogue and to dialogue with people who have no religious affiliations. This is often a big part of the context that I come from. But in the desire for ecumenism, there's often rhetoric of unity. We are together on the most basic points, and I see great value in that. But part of what this talk is about is trying to challenge what might be lost in language of ecumenical unity. That it strikes me when I look back to the early Anabaptist texts and to these histories that many of the criticisms that the Anabaptists had, they are not settled. Like there's still, like, just think about leadership is a great example. Like the way that leadership is done in Protestant Anabaptist circles, the priesthood of all believers, is very different from how leadership is done in more hierarchical churches. Whether it's a Catholic church that goes up to the Pope, or whether it's a charismatic leadership, we should, in the most ecumenical spirit, we should feel more free than I think many of us have to criticize those things, to say, a lot of the grievances and critiques of the radical Reformation, as far as I'm concerned, a lot of them still stand. They're not things that we can just say, those are 500 years old, we set them aside and we're all together now. That's my hesitation with a certain form of ecumenism. Granted, there is a form of ecumenism that is so much more complex and rich, where we encounter difference and we encounter the other, we're challenged, we still have a together feeling, but we understand our differences. Oh, hope that helps.
It's 11:45. You are dismissed from forum today. And it's not you.
Oh, and I hope I didn't go too long.
Nope, it was perfect.